So Microsoft is putting big bucks into Canadian AI. Today, the American company announced a $19 billion investment into expanding Canada's AI sector over a 5-year period. It comes as concerns about Canada's digital sovereignty are growing.
Canada just saw something no one ever expected. A major American corporation went on national television to reassure Canadians because the relationship between Ottawa and Washington has deteriorated so badly under Donald Trump. Microsoft's vice chair appeared not to promote a product, not to announce a simple business expansion, but to effectively apologize on behalf of the United States and promise that Canada could trust his company even if it could no longer trust its closest neighbor. When a U.S. tech giant steps into the role usually reserved for diplomats, it tells us one thing very clearly. Canada's patience with Trump's America has run out, and American companies know it.
It's a year where we appreciate a level of frustration in Canada. We are investing more, $19 billion over 5 years, $7.5 billion in the next 2 years. Right. We want Canada to know that despite whatever issues arise between our two governments, the Canadian people can depend on Microsoft.
Microsoft has announced a staggering $19 billion investment into Canada's AI and cloud future. Brad Smith, the company's vice chair and president, traveled to Ottawa to meet key ministers and soon Prime Minister Mark Carney. But the real story wasn't the money. It was the tone. In his interview, Smith acknowledged that this has been a difficult year for the Canada-U.S. relationship and that Microsoft understands the frustration in Canada. It was an unusual moment. An American executive openly validating Canadian concerns about the behavior of the U.S. government. Smith laid out a detailed plan to protect Canada's digital sovereignty. He said Canadian data will remain in Canadian territory. He said Microsoft will encrypt information so securely that even if another government managed to seize it, it would be unreadable. And then came the line that stunned many viewers. Microsoft, if necessary, will go to court to defend Canadian data against the United States. He reminded Canadians that the company has sued both the Obama and the Trump administrations before, including taking cases all the way to the Supreme Court, and that it is prepared to do so again if Canada's sovereignty is threatened. Smith spoke with the tone of someone drawing a boundary, a promise that the political chaos in Washington would not interfere with Canadian rights, Canadian customers, or Canadian control over their own digital future.
The fact that Microsoft needed to make this intervention says everything about the moment we're living in. The United States, under Trump's second term, has become an unpredictable actor. Reuters, AP, and CBC have all documented the instability. Sudden tariffs on Canadian metals and autos, abrupt threats to tear up trade agreements, and a flurry of executive orders used to pressure allies and industries. Canadian officials privately described the environment as volatile, and Canada's ambassador to Washington recently resigned ahead of the 2026 CUSMA review because the relationship had become nearly impossible to manage. Against that backdrop, Microsoft's reassurance made perfect sense. Trump has created so much uncertainty that even U.S. companies are trying to calm Canada down. And Canada's response, whether stated directly or hinted through policy, is increasingly the same. If Washington can no longer be trusted, then Canada will build systems that do not depend on Washington at all. Prime Minister Mark Carney has been clear since taking office that Canada needs to secure its digital future. His government has accelerated clean electricity expansion, modernized cybersecurity rules, attracted global tech investment, and put digital sovereignty at the center of national strategy. Companies like Microsoft are not just buying servers and building data centers, they are attaching themselves to a country that is stable, predictable, powered by clean energy, and governed by institutions that behave rationally, the exact opposite of the political turbulence in Washington. There is also a broader geopolitical undercurrent. Trump's use of executive authority is far more aggressive in his second term. Canadian officials and journalists have raised concerns that the president could try to use data access the same way he has used tariffs, as a bargaining chip. Smith acknowledged this fear without saying Trump's name directly. He emphasized Microsoft's constant communication with the White House as if to reassure viewers that he is trying to prevent escalation before it happens. And then he delivered the real message. If Trump tries to weaponize data the way he has weaponized trade, Microsoft will not comply. That is a stunning declaration. A multinational corporation is drawing a line between itself and the President of the United States because it sees more long-term value in siding with Canada. It reinforces an emerging pattern visible throughout 2025. Global capital is shifting north. Investors are looking for stability. Technology companies want clean energy and predictable regulation. Nations in Europe and Asia increasingly view Canada as a safe anchor, while the U.S. political environment becomes more erratic. Trump wanted to make America the center of global industry again. Instead, his unpredictability is pushing allies, money, and innovation toward Canada. And Canada, far from being a passive observer, is seizing the moment. Carney's government is positioning the country as a global leader in energy, AI, critical minerals, and cybersecurity. Microsoft's investment is not charity. It is a bet on Canada's trajectory, a bet that Canada will be a more stable and successful hub for the next quarter century than the United States under Trump. What's even more telling is how other countries and companies are responding to the same climate of instability. European partners have begun shifting long-term research initiatives into Canada. Asian investors are expanding clean tech operations in Alberta and Ontario. Even U.S.-based multinationals have quietly increased hiring in Canadian tech hubs because the political risk is lower. All of this reinforces one simple truth. Canada is becoming the safe harbor in a turbulent geopolitical era, a role the United States used to play.
When an American corporation tells Canadians, you can depend on us even when you can't depend on your neighbor, the old idea of an unshakable Canada-U.S. partnership is gone. Microsoft's $19 billion investment is more than a business decision. It is a statement about power, trust, and the new geography of innovation. It is a recognition that Canada is no longer simply an extension of the U.S. tech market, but a sovereign digital nation with the leverage to attract global players on its own terms. Trump did not intend to strengthen Canada, but through instability, he has done exactly that. And the question now is whether this shift marks a temporary detour or the beginning of a long era in which Canada becomes the Western world's stable alternative to Washington's volatility. If U.S. allies and U.S. companies continue turning to Canada for certainty, then the center of North American leadership may be moving north faster than anyone expected. Canada may not have asked for this moment, but it is rising to meet it. And in a world shaped by technological power, data security, and global competition, the nation that others trust most will be the one that leads. Right now, increasingly, that nation is Canada.
Canada just delivered one of the clearest signs yet that the era of quiet deference to Washington is over. After a high-level virtual meeting with Prime Minister Mark Carney, Ontario Premier Doug Ford stepped in front of reporters and delivered a message that captured the country's new direction with stunning clarity.
I want to thank the Prime Minister for traveling around the world and getting Canada out front and making sure that we diversify our trade with other countries.
It wasn't a throwaway line. It was an unmistakable signal that even Ontario, the province most economically tied to the United States and usually the most cautious in moments of Canada-U.S. tension, is now fully aligned with Carney's global pivot. At a time when Donald Trump's administration is imposing sweeping tariffs, freezing communication channels, and trying to pull allies back under American control, Ford's remarks confirmed something Washington hoped wasn't true. Canada is no longer waiting for the United States. It is rewriting its place in the world and winning partners Trump never expected Ottawa to secure. What Ford said wasn't just praise for a prime minister. It was an acknowledgement of a new Canadian strategy. Canada is stepping onto the world stage, deliberately, confidently, and independently.
The remarks came on November 17, 2025, after Carney met virtually with all provincial and territorial leaders to discuss the federal budget and the state of Canada's relationship with the United States. Ford described the meeting as positive and unusually frank, noting that communication between Ottawa and Washington has all but collapsed. Negotiators are still working behind the scenes, but official dialogue remains frozen after months of tariff escalation. Ford explained that while the United States has been pushing for a sector-by-sector negotiation model, focusing on autos, steel, and softwood lumber, Canada cannot afford to sit idle waiting for an American breakthrough. Trump's administration has repeatedly leveraged tariffs as political weapons, and Reuters recently confirmed that Trump publicly declared he would not restart trade talks with Canada after Ottawa's economic messaging campaign frustrated his inner circle. Against that backdrop, Carney briefed the premiers on his fast-paced diplomatic push overseas. From Asia to Europe and the Middle East, Canada has reopened channels, signed new agreements, and secured investment opportunities that simply were not accessible during the previous diplomatic freeze. Ford emphasized that these efforts are not symbolic. They're reshaping where Canada sells its goods, where it sources critical minerals, and where its economic partnerships will come from in the next decade. The meeting also included updates on domestic sectors under strain, including steel and autos, which continue to absorb pressure from U.S. tariffs.
Ford pressed for stronger protections and stricter quota management, arguing that Canada cannot be a dumping ground for low-cost global steel. Far more importantly, however, he highlighted the Prime Minister's broader strategy. Canada must strengthen itself at home while expanding its presence abroad.
Ford's endorsement carried weight precisely because Ontario has historically been the province most intertwined with American supply chains. When a leader in that position says Canada must diversify, it reflects a major national consensus. The reality is simple. Canada can no longer afford to wait for the United States to resolve its internal chaos or clarify its trade objectives. Trump's tariff strategy has made unpredictability the new normal, and industries in Ontario have grown tired of operating in the shadow of U.S. political turbulence. Ford's remarks recognized a truth that Canadians have quietly understood for years but rarely said aloud. Canada has the talent, the resources, and the diplomatic capacity to stand on its own feet. Carney's strategy of traveling around the world is not about prestige, it is about securing alternatives so that when the United States slams a door, Canada does not stand stranded in the corridor. Trump's trade war with Canada was designed to corner Ottawa into submission. Instead, it has triggered the opposite reaction. Companies in both countries are reassessing supply chains, and in some cases, shifting operations north to avoid American volatility. Farmers and manufacturers in the Midwest, many of whom helped elect Trump, are now facing higher costs because Canadian counter-tariffs have redirected supply flows across the Pacific. Meanwhile, Canada's outreach is earning tangible results. Carney's meeting with Xi Jinping produced the first thaw in Canada-China relations since 2018. China invited Carney to Beijing for high-level talks in 2026, while Canada resumed cooperation in clean technology, tourism, and energy transition. In India, negotiations are restarting after years of political chill. Across ASEAN and the Indo-Pacific, Canada is expanding trade, defense, and energy partnerships with countries eager to reduce their own dependence on Washington. What makes this pivot so powerful is that it was forced into motion by Trump himself. Faced with unpredictable tariffs and stalled negotiations, Canada did what middle powers do when global giants falter. It built a better set of options. Traveling around the world undersells the scope of the shift. Carney is not visiting capitals for ceremonial handshakes. He is redrawing Canada's economic architecture. His strategy connects new partners in critical minerals, LNG supply, nuclear technology, AI, advanced manufacturing, and clean electricity. These are the sectors that will define global leadership for the next 30 years, and Canada is anchoring itself inside that future. The United States, meanwhile, is retreating behind tariff walls. Trump's approach relies on coercion and intimidation. Carney's relies on diversification and cooperation. One closes markets, the other opens them. For decades, U.S. policymakers assumed Canada would remain loyal by default, even when mistreated. Trump pushed that assumption past its breaking point. Ford's comments show the American miscalculation. Canada was not drifting away. It was preparing its escape route. And now that escape route is becoming the foundation of a more independent, more confident Canadian identity. Doug Ford's endorsement of Carney's global trade offensive marks a defining moment in modern Canadian politics. It signals the emergence of a unified national strategy, one that protects Canada at home while building influence abroad. Trump's tariffs were meant to weaken Canada, but they accelerated the country's most significant economic realignment in decades. The question now is how far this transformation will go. Will Canada lean even more heavily into Asia and Europe? Will Trump attempt new forms of retaliation? Or will this moment be remembered as the point when Canada finally realized that it did not need permission from Washington to shape its own future? One thing is already clear. Canada has stepped onto the world stage, and this time it's standing there on its own terms.
The administration has used that declaration as a pretext to impose sweeping tariffs on a friend, on a neighbor, on an ally, which are taxes paid by American consumers and businesses on Canadian imports.
In Washington, something unusual is happening. A U.S. senator is standing up not against a foreign rival, but against her own president, and for Canada. That's the story unfolding this week as Senator Amy Klobuchar, joined by both Democrats and Republicans, takes the floor of the U.S. Senate to demand an end to President Trump's tariffs on Canadian goods. At a time when the White House keeps declaring economic victory, the reality looks far different. The tariffs that were supposed to protect America's economy are now dividing its own leaders. Even inside Congress, voices are rising to say what many Americans already feel, that this trade war has gone too far and that its victims are not in Ottawa, but at home. When even Washington senators start echoing the same frustration Canadians have been expressing for months, you know something fundamental has shifted. The resolution introduced by Senator Klobuchar wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was a bipartisan act, backed by Senators Tim Kaine, Rand Paul, Mark Warner, and Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, aimed at formally ending the national emergency Trump invoked to justify tariffs on Canada. Their message is simple: the so-called emergency doesn't exist. There's no security threat at the northern border, no crisis in cross-border trade, only a policy built on political impulse. In April 2025, the Senate had already voted once to terminate the same emergency declaration, but the administration refused to lift it. Instead, it doubled down, raising tariffs to 35% on August 1st, and then added another 10% in late October, this time, astonishingly, in response to a provincial ad campaign from Ontario that used Ronald Reagan's old speech criticizing protectionism. For many in Congress, this was the breaking point. What began as an argument over trade had turned into a test of constitutional power. Lawmakers from both parties began to agree that tariffs imposed by presidential mood swings were destabilizing not just the economy, but America's credibility. It's rare to see Rand Paul and Chuck Schumer agree on anything, yet this time they did, because no matter where they stand politically, they could see that punishing Canada, a historic ally, was punishing America itself. Behind the politics lies a straightforward economic truth. Every tariff is a tax, one that American consumers and businesses pay first. Since the new tariffs began in March 2025, the costs have rippled across U.S. households and industries. According to data cited in the Senate hearing, the average American family is paying nearly $2,000 more per year for everyday goods. Small businesses and tourism towns near the border are feeling it most, with fewer visitors and rising costs for supplies. Aluminum cans, lumber, and farm equipment, all dependent on cross-border supply chains, have become more expensive not because of shortages, but because of policy. Economically, it's a loop that feeds itself. When the U.S. taxes imports from Canada, it drives up domestic prices,
reduces consumer spending, and hurts exports in return. The problem isn't abstract. It's visible in empty stores along border towns and the 20% drop in Canadian visitors this year reported by state tourism boards. So while the administration calls these tariffs America First, the reality looks more like America turning on itself.
North of the border, the response has been measured. Prime Minister Mark Carney, who met recently with several U.S. senators in Ottawa, has avoided escalation. Instead, he keeps stressing dialogue and long-term stability. During those meetings, Carney reportedly told lawmakers that the U.S.-Canada relationship has become mostly transactional. For many Canadians, that single phrase captured the current era perfectly. It signaled that Canada is no longer willing to define its economic identity through Washington's choices. In fact, each new tariff from the White House has only strengthened the case for diversification. Canadian trade missions are multiplying across Asia, and public sentiment at home has shifted sharply towards supporting Buy Canadian initiatives. While American politics seem locked in a cycle of tariff announcements and Senate rebellions, Ottawa's tone is calm, consistent, and confident. It's not the noise of confrontation that defines leadership, but the discipline to outlast it.
Back in Washington, the debate is no longer about whether tariffs are good or bad. It's about limits on power, on law, and on the president's ability to use emergency authority to change trade policy at will. The Senate resolution that Klobuchar and her colleagues pushed forward marks one of the few times in recent memory that Congress has united across party lines to check executive power. The courts, too, are weighing in. A federal trade court panel, composed of judges appointed by 3 different presidents, unanimously ruled that the administration's broad use of emergency powers to impose these tariffs was unlawful under the 1977 National Emergencies Act. Their decision underscored a simple principle: Congress controls the power to tax, not the White House. Economically, the message is just as significant. It reflects a growing recognition that the stability of North American trade, built over decades through the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, cannot survive under constant policy whiplash. When tariffs change 100 times in a single year, as trade groups testified, no company can plan investments or hiring. The revolt in Washington, then, isn't just political. It's a reminder that predictability is part of prosperity. Ironically, while America wrestles with its own divisions, Canada is experiencing a quiet surge in national confidence. The tariffs that were supposed to pressure Canada's economy have instead unified public opinion and accelerated industrial policy. Across provinces, industries are investing more at home and turning outward to new Asian markets. Even U.S. border towns are feeling it, with fewer Canadian visitors and struggling small shops. Tourism losses are now visible across several states. To many observers, it's a striking reversal. The tariffs intended to demonstrate strength have exposed weakness, a U.S. policy so erratic that its own senators, courts, and business groups are working to restrain it. Meanwhile, Canada's measured patience is earning global respect. In the end, this debate is no longer about tariffs or trade statistics. It's about how a nation governs itself under pressure. When senators from both parties rise in the same chamber to tell a president that he's gone too far, it marks a turning point. The same words that once united Americans against foreign competition are now being used to defend cooperation with one of their oldest allies. The lesson is simple. Economic nationalism sounds powerful in a speech, but fragile in practice. Tariffs can start as tools of leverage and end as symbols of isolation. For Canada, the turmoil south of the border is no longer a threat, it's validation. Every time Washington chooses confrontation over cooperation, Canada's case for independence grows stronger. Its leaders are choosing strategy over spectacle, stability over chaos, and long-term partnership over short-term politics. As history has shown, real strength isn't measured by how loudly a country shouts, but by how steadily it stands. And right now, Canada is standing tall, while America argues with itself.
No, I think he's a great prime minister. I mean, he could represent me anytime. I will tell you, I'm not saying that because but he could be nasty. He could be very nasty.
If he's a great man and you want to do a deal with Canada, why aren't you?
Because I want to be a great man too.
The cameras in the Oval Office captured what looked like a normal diplomatic moment. Smiles, flags, and two leaders talking about trade. But behind the polished setting, something else was happening. President Donald Trump was trying to defend his economic strategy, and instead of showing control, he showed confusion. The meeting between Trump and Prime Minister Mark Carney was meant to highlight progress. For months, Washington and Ottawa have been locked in a tariff dispute that's hurting both sides. The United States has kept high import taxes on Canadian steel, aluminum, and vehicles, while Canada has held firm, refusing to make concessions without guarantees of stability. Trump wanted to turn this moment into proof that his America First policy was working. Instead, it became a moment that revealed how his message is beginning to backfire. Trump entered the room with confidence. Carney, calm as ever, stayed focused. The difference between them wasn't just in tone, it was in discipline. Trump spoke to the cameras, Carney spoke to the facts. By the time the press conference ended, Trump's own words had done more to weaken his argument than anything Carney could have said. When reporters asked about trade, Trump jumped from topic to topic. He talked about how both countries want to make cars in steel, then shifted to crime, border security, and even drug boats supposedly destroyed off Venezuela. He claimed the United States now had no fishing boats left because of his crackdown on maritime drug smuggling. None of it had anything to do with tariffs or trade. Then came the numbers. Trump repeated that more than $17 trillion of new investment had poured into the United States in just 8 months. Independent agencies like the Congressional Budget Office and the Bureau of Economic Analysis have no record of any figure close to that. U.S. foreign direct investment for all of 2024 was under $500 billion, according to BEA data. The claims simply didn't fit any verified economic reality. His answers blurred together, mixing pride, anger, and self-promotion. One minute he spoke of love for Canada. The next he accused Canada of taking American car factories. He said the two countries hurt each other when we compete, even as he argued his tariffs were helping both nations. Viewers expecting a clear policy statement saw instead a president struggling to link his thoughts. Trump's unpredictability once drew attention. Now it looked like drift. The questions became shorter. The answers grew longer, wandering into shutdown politics and attacks on Democrats. He spoke about cities like Chicago and Washington as if they were symbols of decline, then suddenly declared them safe again. It left the impression of a leader who could no longer separate the economy from the performance around it. Through it all, Mark Carney stayed mostly silent. When he did speak, his message was structured. Canada, he said, is America's second-largest trading partner and its biggest foreign investor, with $500 billion invested in the U.S. over the past 5 years. The contrast was striking. Trump followed with another round of flattery. He called Carney a great man and a strong leader. The praise kept coming. When a reporter asked why, if Carney was so great, there was still no trade deal, Trump smiled and said, "Because I want to be great too." The laughter that followed was polite but uneasy. Carney smiled lightly and let the silence do the work. In that silence, Trump's showmanship lost its edge. What should have been a demonstration of authority became a reminder that charisma without clarity cannot move policy. Trump's compliments might have been genuine, but they carried a tone of insecurity. By lifting Carney so high, he shifted the spotlight away from himself. The press conference became a showcase of contrast, a disciplined Canadian leader beside an American president drifting between ego and admiration. The confusion on display mirrors what's happening in the real economy. Since early 2025, Trump's tariff strategy has driven up costs for U.S. manufacturers that depend on Canadian materials. According to data from the Department of Commerce, import costs for aluminum and steel from Canada rose nearly 18% by August. Automakers in Michigan and Ohio report delays in component delivery and increased expenses that have already forced temporary layoffs. At the same time, Canadian exports to the United States have become more expensive, slowing production on both sides of the border. Carney's government has responded by investing in domestic critical mineral projects and negotiating with Europe and Asia for alternative markets. In short, Canada adapted. The U.S. absorbed the inflation. Trump's tariffs were supposed to strengthen American industry. Instead, they've exposed how deeply interdependent North America's economy really is. Even Trump's supporters in the industrial Midwest are now warning that prolonged tariffs could cost more jobs than they save. The Oval Office meeting was Trump's chance to reset the story, to show leadership, to present a path forward. But the world saw a president tangled in his own narrative. His claims inflated, his focus evaporated. By the time he declared that America is the hottest country in the world right now, the contrast with Canada's calm tone could not have been sharper. When the meeting ended, there was no new deal, no policy shift, no breakthrough. But there was a clear impression. Trump's show of strength had turned into a show of weakness. The same tariffs that were meant to project dominance are now isolating America from its closest ally. Mark Carney left Washington with quiet confidence. Trump left with applause, but also with headlines questioning his command of the facts. The contrast told its own story. Canada stayed patient and consistent. The United States, under Trump's shifting narrative, looked divided and uncertain. What was meant to project power ended as self-exposure. Trump's tariffs hurt his economy. His words hurt his credibility. And the Oval Office, the stage of presidential authority, became the mirror that showed how a leader's performance can undo the very power he tries to display.